It's 10 a.m. I'll hand it over to Susan Shelton from the Washington State Department of Health, who has her presentation, Cool Science, Clear Strategy, Washington's Shallow Layer Approach to Cooling.
All righty, great. Thank you very much, Jacob. I appreciate it. Again, my name is Susan Shelton with Washington State Department of Health. I'm incredibly excited to be here. I loved watching the poll results. I used to teach hand washing when I was early in my public health career, and I honestly thought, because I used to teach every single elementary school student in my district hand washing from K through 5. And my first year, I thought, oh, I've nailed this. I am done. I'm going to have all these kids taught. By the time they get to high school, they're going to totally have the lesson learned. I'm not going to teach it again. And I'm sure all of you that have worked in public food safety or public health know that nope, that lesson did not stick. So I'm here to tell you that repeated messaging from all of us is what it takes to change to the better public health. So I want to talk to you today, and I am glad that you had someone in there, I think it was Fernando, actually said cooling was the item that they would like to train the public on. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about today, is how we use some science that we've generated over the decades to change how we do cooling in the state of Washington. I encourage you, if you have questions, similar to our last speaker, will happily answer those at the end. I will also make sure that my slides are available to you if you want them going forward. But again, any questions that you have, I'd be happy to answer along the way. So I want to give you a little bit of a general layout of Washington State. So I'm with the Washington State Department of Health. We develop, interpret, train, advise on the code, help our local health jurisdictions. We do a lot of the illness outbreaks. We also oversee a lot of the state facilities, so the hospitals, our ferry system. We do community colleges. But we also partner with our State Department of Agriculture. They do our manufactured foods, they do our custom slaughter and processing. They also do our cottage foods. That is not done by health, that's done by ag. And then we also partner with others. So our Department of Social and Health Services, they oversee our long-term care facilities like nursing homes. But our primary partner is going to be our local health jurisdictions. We have 35, and they oversee the vast majority of retail food establishments. We're what's considered local control. So while we write the rule at the state level, we assist the local jurisdictions that actually implement and enforce it. So they work on their own policies under their own local boards of health. King County is our largest. It houses Seattle, and they have approximately 14,000 food establishments. Garfield is our smallest. It has 12 food establishments. So we have quite a range, east and west across the Cascades. And it's a great environment to work in because we definitely see a lot of variety up in Washington State. Also, you're probably familiar with our Mount Rainier, so that's a little bit of a background. Our program specifically is relatively small. We have a program supervisor, Sammy Berg. I'm the technical lead, so I'm the one that primarily issues the guidance and interpretation of the food code. We have Mile Tillier, who is our foodborne illness outbreak investigator. She's part-time in our program and then part-time CD Epi. She's one of our epidemiologists. We have Elisa Pilot, Hunter, and she does our special projects. So she does projects throughout the year. One she's working on right now is a system we call FINS, which is our foodborne outbreak notification system. We rolled out last year an automated system where people can log into the internet and then it connects based on where their food establishment was with the local jurisdiction, or it gets forwarded to one of our other partners. And then we have Cindy Free, who is our program specialist, and she is a lot of our admin and then quite a bit of programmatic support. Our goal for today is we're going to talk a little bit about some of our historical outbreaks and some of the history that we have with the food code in Washington State related to cooling. So again, I'm very specific to cooling for this session. I want to show you what it looks like in our code. We have adopted the FDA model food code. We've adopted the 2017 version, but we put it into our administrative code language. And so we'll have our own code numbers, but then we reference the FDA food code, and then we often modify. So this is our section on cooling. It does align with FDA food code 3501.14, which are the methods or ways to cool. but you'll see that we made a difference. We actually require that they cool in shallow layers. It's got to be uncovered. It's got to be in refrigerator that maintains 41 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. So they can't just leave it on the counter. It's like it goes automatically into the refrigerator, uncovered, and then it stays there. And it has to be a shallow layer. The thickness is 2 inches. If it's a food like beans, rice, a meatloaf would have to be 2 inches or less. If it's an intact cut of meat, so maybe a large roast that isn't comminuted, we allow that to be up to 4 inches. And then they put that onto the shallow pan and they put that in the refrigerator. So they're required to cool that way. Often when we have corporate businesses come in, they'll be like, well, you guys are the only one that require this. And we're like, we recognize that. And we've been doing it for about 30 years. So we're very familiar with this concept. I'm going to mention Chick-fil-A only because he has spoken publicly about it. When they first came into Washington State, they were similarly going, this is so bizarre. We don't have to do this in any other state, and so it was a little bit of a learning curve for them. But the reason why I'm bringing them up is because they spoke publicly on how that cooling method, they're using it in their other locations because it works so much better for them and for their teams. And so we do see quite a few businesses that's a little bit of an adjustment when they come into the state. Now, I do want to mention that we do allow the FDA two-step cooling as an alternative. So yes, they still can use an ice bath. They still can use an ice paddle, but then we will hold them to make sure that they're making sure that it cools down in those 2 steps. We really try to steer people to using a shallow layer cooling method in Washington State. I'm going to cover a little bit of the history about why we got to that place and then show some examples too about how we look for it in the field. But first, I want to talk about the outbreaks that we investigate in Washington. It is something that we watch carefully. We are an active supporter of the NEAR system, so the National Environmental Assessment Reporting System, NORS, all of the ways that we report infectious or illnesses that are spread through food, especially. So we've been doing this for decades. We do make an annual report. I've got these numbers here from 2022 just so I can compare them a little bit. And so these are the outbreaks that we've recorded. Now, we do get a lot more notifications of outbreaks. And again, an outbreak for us is 2 or more illnesses associated with a shared exposure through food, water, and ice. But these are the ones that we report to CDC. We investigate a lot, but we're like, we can't tell if that's actually what caused the illnesses for these individuals. So you'll see that you might think, well, these numbers look low. But again, this is because these are the ones that we reported to CDC because we were not able to identify a relationship in others or maybe a causative agent. And so we range between about 25 up to, 65, depends. When you see that we've had a lot of outbreaks for us, it's generally because we had a contaminated food source. So a lot of you probably remember we had contaminated lettuce, we've had contaminated peanut butter, we've had a lot of cases and outbreaks linked back to those. Sometimes though, what I'm not showing on this screen is our case counts. Sometimes, this will have cases as small as 2 to 4 people, but then we'll have some over 100 people that were ill. And so it can really range on how many people get sick. But the reason why I wanted to show you these numbers is because I wanted to show you when we look at the causative agent, which of those are caused by cooling. And so over the last 10 plus years, we've had about 34, 36, somewhere in that range that were linked, that we traced back and went, okay, these were caused by improper cooling. And so for us, it's really important to identify the actual causative contributing factor so we can do better with our code changes, to do better with our education, to train our inspectors to look differently, to work with our persons in charge and help them control the risks a little bit differently. So we always look at, and every year we evaluate, do trend analysis and go, okay, this is where we had some gaps. We need to make some cleanup. So you'll see, I think, by looking at this, that our cooling isn't necessarily one of our leading causes. And it hasn't been. It hasn't been for 20 years. It hasn't been. But I want to show you what it used to be. It used to be a leading cause of outbreaks in Washington State. So between 1976 and 1980, you'll see that blue bar. So again, that's a span of 4 years. So a picture of 4 of our bars here all combined into one. But back then in the late 70s, we had 53 of the total of 62 outbreaks were actually linked back to cooling. And so that's why we made an emphasis of it in Washington State, because like we've identified that we have a major gap here with bacterial toxin production in food. And so a lot of work was done. Okay, so I'm going to revisit that a little bit, some of the work that was done because of all of these outbreaks that were in the state of Washington back in the late 70s and early 80s. But I want to tell you that we still do this. So I don't want you to think that I showed you a grid from 2022, but this is our numbers from last year. So last year we had 28 outbreaks. I will say our numbers dropped down quite a bit, probably from reporting after COVID. So we are, it's not necessarily because we're just cleaning up all of our issues. We would love to think that's what it is, but we think it's also a little bit of a reporting issue. It's one of the reasons why we started our FINS, our online outbreak reporting that's consistent across the state to make sure we're getting customer reports of illness. But even back last year, most of our illnesses were linked back to contamination. The next one down was survival, so improper cooling, improper cooking, more than likely, or improper acidification. I know our last presenter was talking about some processes and variances. So yes, if you don't do acidification properly, you can have some survival, but then you'll see we still have cooling issues, or we still have hot holding issues, or room temperature storage issues. We still have proliferation problems. So I want to show you those. So again, the vast majority of our illness outbreaks from last year were from contaminated ill workers. Primarily, we had some contaminated products. We had some cross-contamination as well. But you'll see the yellow in the middle. This is improper cooling. We had 4 of those. We also had some inadequate cold holding. So we had some cold holding units that weren't working properly and potentially led to illness. And then some just weren't monitoring temperatures at all. Often that means they just left it on the counter for us. Survival, we had so improper cooking. We also had no cooking. So we had a lot of raw product, and then inadequate reheating as well. So let me just show you just a couple of examples of some of the outbreaks that we've seen in Washington recently, because I don't want you to think that we think we've got this totally gone. So we had an outbreak linked back to a Chinese menu restaurant. It was camphor tea ducks, smoked over tea and camphor leaves. It was suspected toxin. We weren't able to collect it out of the food. We had 5 people reporting ill. When they did the environmental investigation, they found that the duck had been stored at ambient temperature. So once it was smoked, it really wasn't refrigerated again. It was smoked kind of in a wooden kind of area. So there were quite a bit of temperature abuse. So that was one of our proliferation issues. Again, not linked to shallow layer cooling, another problem that we have to work on with cooling. Another one we had was in a Mexican menu restaurant. It was improper cooling and reheating of tamales. And again, this was a suspect bacterial toxin. We had 7 people reporting ill. When they went and did the review on these, they found the tamales had been improperly cooled after they've been assembled. Those of you that have done inspections on tamales, there's a lot of production, a lot of prep, and they're in mass quantities. And so there is a lot of potential there for some room temperature storage, some buildup of heat, and then improper cooling if they're put in, often they're put in stacked layers. So they can be cooled incorrectly. Also, on top of that, they were improperly reheated. So we didn't have necessarily a potential kill if we could have. There are some germs that grow back that you can destroy. There are some toxins that you cannot, even if you properly heat. We also had a seafood menu restaurant. We had Clostridium perfringens suspected. This one, they were using ice wands. Like, yeah, we totally use ice wands. And then when the inspector was working with them, they're like, yeah, but you make a lot of lobster bisque. How many ice wands do you have? And I think they had 1, maybe 2. And yet they had container after container after container of this bisque. And so, yes, it's doing that follow through going, okay, you use ice wands, but you don't have enough for the amount of production that you do. So that was the outbreak linked to our bisque. And then we had one with some improper hot holding of rice, beans, shredded chicken. So it was improperly hot held. But on top of that, we identified that they were cooling foods in large volumes. So for those of you that have been doing this job, maybe for up to 5 years, you just got hired into public health, you're learning all sorts of these great things about, doing commercial food inspections. You're probably like, oh, the cooling doesn't look real, it looks kind of normal. When I started, they were cooling in 5-gallon buckets with lids on them. and they were stacked. I mean, that's commonly what we saw when I started working in public health. So we've definitely made a lot of improvements, but in Washington State specifically, I want to talk a little bit more. Okay, I also want to just mention, highlight at least, that the two pathogens of concern that we have traditionally with cooling are going to be Clostridium perfringens and Bacillus cereus. They are spore formers, and so when you get them heated, they can then germinate potentially. And when they germinate, they often either grow into more cells, but they also potentially make a toxin that can either survive the reheat process or actually grow inside your body and intoxicate you from the inside out. And so we have quite a few issues with these because, again, they can grow back after you cook, which is why we primarily focus on these two. These are the ones that we think of when we think of cooling pathogens of concern, which are the germs that we worry the most about. Now, for those of you that are like, well, any food, if it gets dripped on by, blood, I saw somebody had cross-contamination they wanted to train the public on. Yeah, if you've got something that drips onto the food, that'll recontaminate. But that isn't necessarily a sign of improper cooling. That is a sign of poor contamination. So perfringens specifically, again, it's spore forming. It causes a food infection. So what that means is then it grows inside the body. It doesn't make a preformed toxin that you consume. You actually ingest a lot of this germ, and then it grows inside of your digestive tract, and it poisons you from the inside out. So this one has an incubation generally about 8 to 12 hours. It does cause watery diarrhea, nausea, abdominal cramping. Fever is generally very rare. And then it lasts for 1 to 2 days. And then the common foods that we usually think of are meats, poultries, gravies, and then again, foods prepared in large batches. Oftentimes people will call this one the cafeteria germ because usually it's associated with foods that are made in large batches. Now, I also want to mention, while the symptoms usually do go away within 1 to 2 days, this one can cause necrotizing damage. We will have deaths from this one periodically because it's kind of gangrene inside of the intestinal system. And so I'm very interested in perfringens, always happy to talk about these. I know you have quite a few scientists that are coming in later and they're more adept at speaking on these than I am, but it's really good to know the pathogens because it helps us with our control, but it also, I think, helps us appreciate why we do the job that we do. I want to mention Bacillus cereus as well, just as a highlight. Bacillus cereus has two different types of toxin, well, a couple different types of toxins that it can produce. One is what we call emetic. It can cause vomiting. And that one will have a pretty rapid onset like Staph aureus because this one is a preformed toxin. So the bacteria grow inside of the rice or the starch or the grain, and they preform that toxin, which is not destroyed by cooking. So even if you heat it up really hot, it's not going to necessarily destroy the toxin that was created in the food. You ingest that, usually within half an hour to 6 hours, you will potentially have severe onset of nausea and vomiting. That one also is usually self-limiting. It usually goes away. It can also cause severe liver damage. So that's how people usually get a severe response to Bacillus cereus. It's called cereulide is the name of the toxin. And it can actually affect the liver. Again, these are commonly found in temp abuse starches, but Bacillus cereus can also be in other foods, meats, stews, gravies. This one often causes a diarrheal. So it's the same bacteria, but it just produces different toxins. The diarrheal illness actually is when you take in large quantities of the bacteria and then it gives you a toxin from the inside out. So it's like that perfringens that we just talked about. You don't get preformed toxin. It actually produces it inside your body. So this one has a little bit longer incubation and a little bit different of symptoms for that. It's a lower GI kind of thing. So again, these are the two pathogens of concern that we really focus on. And these are the ones that when I talk about the outbreaks that we linked back to cooling, we're looking for these pathogens specifically. So I want to show you. Hopefully I'm going okay with my pace. I want to keep you on your time schedule, and I do talk fast, but I want to talk a little bit about the cooling history of Washington. I really like to know kind of how things have transferred along the way. And so I want to start you in 1976. So that was when we had the United States Public Health Service. Most of us used their food service manual, or we based our code off of the food service manual from the PHS. And again, this was back in 1976, so it was before the model food code that most of us use now. Back then, they required that you cooled hot foods to 45 degrees within 4 hours. So actually, it was pretty strict. They allow 6 hours now, which is still tough. But technically, back then, they were saying 4 hours. So in 1980, we had that in our state code. We had to cool in less than 4 inch depths. So we did require that they cooled in relatively shallow layers. We used to say 4 inches back in 1980. That's what we had weighed in on. And we did require them to cool down to 45 degrees within 4 hours. So we were still maintaining the public health standard of cooling to 45 within 4, but we were requiring a shallowish layer of 4 inches. Okay, so and yet, so this is back in 1980, that's what our requirement was. But we were having a lot of outbreaks linked back to rice specifically and beans. And so you'll see that the studies that we're going to talk about in a moment were linked back to those food products. And so they were focused on Cantonese restaurants and fried rice. So there was a study that Washington did with CDC in 1981. I'm going to show you that one. I'm also going to show you the study in 1984, a couple years later, and this was about Mexican style food service. So both of these studies were because we had this requirement. We were following the public health service requirement of cooling to 45 within 4 hours. We also required that they use a shallow layer. So we were like, don't use a bucket. We're like, use a shallow layer. And still, we're still seeing a lot of outbreaks for this. And so they did some additional work in 1981 and 1984 to figure out, okay, what's going on inside these food facilities? And then there was another article in 1988 that I want to share with you because it was like, what is going on in food facilities altogether? Where are the risks? What are the issues with food service? And this is one of my favorite studies. Yes, it's 30 years old, almost 40, but it's still a good historical look at what is all the causes of these risks that we see in food service that are related to foodborne illness outbreaks. Okay, going along our timeline. So 1988, all right. 1992 is when Washington modified our code and we said, you know what? The 4 inches is not shallow enough. We want you to do less than 2 inches for these mixed up foods. Again, we allowed the comminuted foods to be at 2 inches, but then the intact pieces of meat, those were 4. And then we required that they put them in the refrigerator immediately. Okay, so we made that requirement in 1992. Again, because we had it before where it was less than 4 inches and we were having some issues. And so like, okay, let's make it a little bit more shallow based on the studies that we did. All right, so in 1992, we had our own code. That was the year before the model food code came out from the FDA. And so we had our own WAC and we maintained our own WAC until 2005, which is when we adopted the FDA version of the food code. So we adopted their version, but we also maintained our shallow layer. So we had both. We adopted the 2017 version of the food code as well, which is where we are right now. And then we started to submit some issues to CFP. Okay, and we'll talk about those as well, because it's going to potentially affect you in Arizona. All right, so I want to show you just some highlights from some of these studies that I referenced. So in 1981, this was the Cantonese restaurants and fried rice study. It was investigating rice handling and retail food. It was done by Frank Bryan. Some of you might recognize his name. He's from the CDC. He's pretty famous from historical food safety at CDC. You'll see a lot of work from Frank Bryan. Charles Bartleson, his name is Bert Bartleson for us. He is from Washington State Department of Health. And then we also had Norma Christopherson from our, I think she was also from, let me look here. She was from DSHS back in the day. So, but she was associated with Washington. But what they did is they did looking at Bacillus cereus in boiled and fried rice in Cantonese restaurants because they were trying to identify again about all the different things that would slow down the cooling. They were really focused on, how are you cooling these foods and what are the good ways to cool them? If you're interested in any of these studies, I'm happy to share them. I think they're also available online, but I'm also happy just to send them to you directly. What I wanted to identify here was all the different things that they tested, and I'm going to show you some of their testing in a moment. Their most significant factor that they identified for cooling was the depth of the rice. All right, so they have found that depths of 3 inches or less cooled rapidly, but anything at a greater depth cooled down the rice slowly. Okay, so when I said we require them to be at 2 inches or shallower, um, most of our science shows it can actually be approaching to 3 and still be safe. So we have a little bit of a buffer is why we're at 2 inches or less. And again, we'll talk about airflow, we'll talk about movement, we'll talk about stacking, things like that. One thing that we identified is it's not necessarily the plastic container that does have a little bit of an impact. Metal is generally better, but what we found is every single time it's the depth because the depth is going to be proportional to the surface area. All right. So it doesn't necessarily matter how wide, or deep or, length the pan is. It's the depth that actually says this is how you control the surface area of this product. And so depth is what this article identified. Now I'm going to show you this just kind of for fun, especially for those of you that have been, working within the internet age for your entire career. This is how we used to do our pie charts. And so you'll see that of the outbreaks from 1976 to 1978, they were associated with Chinese, specifically restaurants. They implicated rice almost a quarter of the time. So it's just giving you an example to go, okay, this is why we were focusing so much on rice back in the late 70s, early 80s. Because I want to show you another study. So this one is the Mexican style food service. This is specific again to beans and rice that were cooling instead of Mexican style food services. It talks about a lot of our outbreaks that we identified back then, again, still in the 70s, that we were identifying these outbreaks. Now this one, what they identified was that you can actually evaluate proper cooling by monitoring rather than actually taking temperature steps along the way. So what this was showing is that it's easier to train both inspectors, but also operators and food workers that here's how you can modify or monitor cooling. Because if we tell them you have to cool in this, two-step method, you've got to monitor from 135 to 70 down to 41. After that, you have 4 hours, 6 hours total. It gets very confusing for operators. It gets very confusing to train that, especially in Washington. We have a lot of different languages as well. So often we can just train easier. And that's what this study was also identifying. But I want to show you a little bit about what they were doing. So here's what they had. They had all these containers like you commonly see. Still to this day, when you're looking in food service, you can see a bucket. You can see several hotel pans of different depths. You can see bain-marie kind of pans that are going to fit in an inset kind of a soup warmer, and you'll see each of those. And so they filled all these containers. Again, this is from the early 80s, but they then used masking tape, put it over there so they could put the thermocouple, the temperature monitor, in the middle of the product. They did it to all of them. Again, putting the thermometer sensor in the middle of, so the center of mass on each of these items. Here it looks like with rice. And they put it in the walk-in. And then each of these, for this portion of the study, they kept covered. All right, so they did a whole bunch of different angles. And if you look at this carefully, and I'm sorry, it's a little grainy, truthfully, in order for us to get these pictures, we had to convert them from 35mm slides. I mean, that's how old school we were talking here with this study. But you can see that several of them, they all have lids, but you can also see that on the bottom portion of the walk-in, several of them are stacked, and some of them are pushed up against each other. So that way you can kind of go, oh, okay, I see how these are all placed inside this unit. All right. And so then they did a schematic. They're like, okay, this is how we had it set up. So some examples would be, you saw that if you look at the top right of this picture, you'll see number 2. These are going to indicate that we had all these pans that were stacked up. And then that middle one that has the 5 in the middle was the one that they're going to put the temperature measurement in. So each of the ones that they were like, okay, so that's number 2. So number 2 had products all stacked around it. And that is this line here. You'll see 2 on top of it's the one that took the longest to cool down. All right, which shouldn't surprise you. If you have a whole bunch of food stacked and it's in a lid, it's going to take the longest to cool down. All right, but then you can see the other ones as well. So we have a cylindrical pan, number 1 here. It was filled a total of 7 inches. It has a lid on it, and you can see that it also took a considerable amount of time to cool. and honestly never got down to 45 degrees, which was the requirement back then. After the span of 15 hours, it's still going off the grid. None of these products actually got down to proper temperature. So you'll see four. Four is a shallow layer. It is 2.5 inches deep, but again, it's covered. And so it also did not maintain a proper cooling speed to get down to temperature. All right, so they were showing that these were examples that they saw out in the field, and they were just looking to see how long they took to cool. One thing that we really do focus on, and this is a critical component for us, which is kind of a mind meld for a lot of inspection staff, is we're really focusing on this temperature range between 70 and 120. We're trying to push it through that down below 70. And that's because that is the optimal growth range for Clostridium perfringens and Bacillus cereus. All right, so temperatures below that, those germs grow a lot slower. So our primary goal is just to get them down below 70 degrees within a couple of hours. All right, so then they tried this one. This one, they're going to put a whole bunch of food into the refrigerator. Again, it's rice. And then they measured it with different depths, but this time it was uncovered. So it didn't have that same setup that we saw in the original picture. And you can see here, again, this is the temperature range we're trying to drive, but you'll see here that these actually reached proper temperature. So the 2 inches deep reached the proper below 45 degrees at this shallow layer within the span of about 2.5 hours. And then others similarly got there over time. The one that was 6 inches deep never did. It would eventually, but it didn't in the span of 8 hours, and similar to the one that was 4 inches deep. All right. So again, these come from the studies that I will share with you if you're interested in reviewing them more. I'm just trying to give you an idea of kind of why our decision making came as it did. So those were in the early 80s. This is the point that I want to drive home, is cooling was a leading cause of outbreaks between 1977 and 1982. When Frank Bryan wrote this report, he was looking at the study about all the different things that can go wrong inside of a retail food establishment and cause an outbreak. And they're like, yes, the leading cause is cooling, but because we're missing it because nobody's really evaluating it because there's other things going on. And it's like we don't usually see cooling. So we know it's a leading cause, but it's so hard to evaluate because we don't usually see it. They do it at night, or it's already cooled, or even now it's hard to evaluate if it's already cold, but you're like, I can't tell how you did the process. Right. So this article to me is really valuable because it's like we're missing this, even though it's one of our leading causes of outbreaks. And I also think it's still going on this day. I still think, we miss cooling because we aren't able to evaluate it very effectively if we're not using the shallow layer method. All right, so that was in 88. 92, again, I told you that we adopted the requirement. We've had this in our code, codified in our code, shallow layer, 2 inches or less since 1992. We adopted the 2017. We're just plugging along. We kept our shallow layer cooling. For us, our numbers of outbreaks linked back to cooling have just dropped off the shelf. We talked about that at the beginning. We were doing fine. Bert, the gentleman from Department of Health that did all this work back in the 80s, actually petitioned and submitted an issue to CFP many decades ago to get it incorporated into the food code back then. But it didn't pass. And we didn't look at it. We didn't look at it again. And we just kept adopting it. We kept modifying. When we adopted the food code, we would modify it and add in our shallow layer cooling, and we kept going that way. And then we started having people ask us about it, like in 2017. And one of them was a fellow from IFPTI, Mike Orovitz, from Nevada. His poster is available online. This is a little blurry. I'm not intending for you to read it here. I just want to give him credit. He did a lot of work identifying what was going on in Nevada. He's like, we're finding that they're not being compliant with cooling. And he's like, I like this idea of using the shallow layer instead of the, two-step cooling method. So as part of his fellowship, he did a study on it, talked with our Bert Bartleson and talked with several operators that use it. And, also similar concluded that it could benefit them to actually switch over to a shallow layer cooling. So we started seeing a little bit of national interest in what we were doing. And again, talking with Mike during his project, but then also looking at the risk factor studies from the FDA. If you start looking at these, and they're available, I have it linked here, but it is their risk factor studies that they've got. This is the one from a few years ago, but I want to show you on their grid where they talk about the total top 10 items that are reported out of compliance. Number 7 is foods are cooled properly. So again, when they're going into facilities, the first one, 85 of their fast food restaurants, they see are out of compliance, and they've done, that's about half. So 49.42 are out of compliance when they do the risk factor study observations as part of the FDA. Then if you slide over though and go to the full service, so that's quick service. And I think a lot of us recognize there isn't a lot of things that you cool down in a quick service food establishment. But then you go over to a full service and you'll see that that is almost 72% of the time do they observe improper cooling during a risk factor study. So if you're not even close to seeing it almost 3/4 of the time that you have people cooling, then we might be missing something. So because of this, and we had Minnesota that was specifically interested in submitting an issue to CFP again. And so we partnered with Minnesota. They were the driving bus on this. They were the most interested. I mean, we were like, we've been living it for 30 years, but sure, we'll sign on. And so in partnership with Minnesota, we worked on submitting issues to CFP, submitted one in 2023, gave them some of our data that we showed that we are not finding outbreaks when they cool correctly. It's when they don't cool correctly. And again, we cut down our numbers so much because we focus with them on the products that we need to fix, like the large chickens, the tamales, things like that are difficult to use a shallow layer for. So we submitted this issue in 2023. It actually passed council to incorporate the shallow layer cooling as an option. But it didn't pass through the delegates. The delegates voted it down. So it didn't go to FDA at that time. We reconfigured, worked with additional states, worked with Minnesota again, driving. We also had several academic partners that were very participatory. We had quite a bit of industry participation. And so it was represented for CFP this year. So if you want to look them up, it's on the foodprotect.org website. But you can look up issues 3-29 and 3-30. 3-29 is suggesting a change to actually clarify what shallow layer is. So it says to put food, currently the food code says to put food into smaller or thinner portions, and this one just says 2 inches or less, so it quantifies that. There are also attached with this issue specifically, some of the science. There's been a lot of recent science. I shared with you the stuff we did in the 80s. This stuff was done in the last 5 years, all in support of these issues. So there have been a lot of studies that have been done on proper cooling methods using the shallow layer. Part of that, the studies have been actually doing modeling. So like, yes, we recognize it doesn't cool down to 41 degrees. It doesn't always. Some foods do not cool down within the 41 degrees. However, we have shown that it does not allow the growth of the spore formers, and it will get there at the point that it doesn't allow the regrowth of other pathogens. And then issue number 30, though, is the one that says you can use this as an option and not have to do the 2-step cooling method. So if you have a shallow layer, 41 degrees or colder, uncovered, then you can use this method. Now, the FDA concurred. So it passed through the delegates, it passed through CFP, it was forwarded by the executive board to the FDA, and they actually concurred on this. And so they will be incorporating it. I have no idea how they're going to be incorporating it, but you should be able to see it in the 2026 version of the FDA food code, which I've heard is supposed to be released next summer. Again, we don't have advance notice of what the language they're going to use. I have no idea exactly what they're going to do. But it is going to potentially be in the next food code. Now, I just want to show you a couple of pictures. Oh, wait, no, I need to go back. So what do we look for out in the field? A lot of people ask us, do you take a ruler? No, we really don't. You can. They have a lot of food grade rulers out there. You can, but we usually, look at a hotel pan, and sometimes, we can take a ruler if we need to explain it to people. People generally have a pretty good idea of what a shallow layer 2-inch pan is, but and we have been doing it for so long in Washington that most of our facilities were like, you need shallow layer pans, you need shallow layer pans. So the things that we do look for, so this is the difference. and maybe it's not different for you, but this is what we really practice. We look for foods that they probably cool down. We're like, oh, you've got a lot of food here. Talk to me about how you cool this down. Show me how you do this. Because I may not see it, but I'm like, I see it hot, and I know these things are hard to cool, and I know you've got a lot of them. Oh, these things look, they may not be out of temperature. You shouldn't cool these down at all. So we incorporate that concept of talking to them about it when we see it hot. When we see a lot of hot holding, when we see a lot of tilt kettles, when we see a lot of steam tables, we're like, oh, you've got a lot of hot food. Let's talk about how you cool this down. And then obviously we look for pieces of equipment that they have. We're like, oh, you have a blast chiller. Talk to me about how you use this. That's rare, but we have a few. Okay, I see you have, an ice paddle. Talk to me about that. How many do you have? You have one? Okay, that's a good conversation to have. This is a shallow layer pan. If we don't see any, we're like, how do you cool your food down? Because honestly, I expect to see a lot of shallow layer pans whenever I do an inspection in a facility that has a lot of hot food. Obviously, we look in coolers. Yes, I will tell you, we staged that cooler a little bit on the left, but we did it for a point. But that is kind of what we look for. We look for all those traditional foods that need a lot of cooling and they don't have a lot of space. We look for items and making sure that they're single layer, adequate airflow, and movement around. So we have a lot of things that we look for. We also look for a lot of things that appear to be improperly cooled. So for us, we do not allow it to be covered. The picture on the top right actually has a lot of condensation. We talk about the difference between small condensation on the top. So small would probably be just that's natural moisture. You start seeing something that actually generates water, like we see on the top right. That was covered throughout its cooling. The product on the bottom right is way over the shallow layer pan. That's too deep. The buckets on the left bottom, those, even if the temperature is correct, if this was how it was cooled, for us, that is a correction. We're like, this was not a proper cool step for these products. So again, it also helps us evaluate their cooling. So I want to finalize with this concept. Shallow layers for us is stronger control. We have seen that it has reduced outbreaks in Washington state dramatically. We still have outbreaks with cooling, but because it's made it so much easier for us to train and inspect and test out in the field, the outbreaks that we have now are much smaller than what we used to have. They're smaller in quantity, but they're also smaller in number. So again, for us, shallow layers, it's easier to train. It's very easy for us to communicate with new inspectors, but also for operators to communicate with their staff. Everybody can tell what it looks like. It's easier to do. You keep it shallow, you leave it uncovered, and the refrigerator is actually doing the work. You do have to make sure the refrigerator stays cold. It's not passive. The refrigerator is doing the work, but you still have to set it up right. We also do require a 2-inch barrier around it. What I mean by that is you can't stack it. It's got to have 2 inches of airflow around it. The studies that I mentioned talk about that. We do want to have 2 inches above it so that nothing impedes the airflow. It's easy to verify. Again, not just the inspectors, the PIC. Our whole goal is to get managers to have active managerial control. They can actually verify it visually and make sure their staff is cooling correctly. It's also easier to repeat. It's not something, it gets muscle memory. You do it over and over and over. It's like, yep, this is totally doable. It's not something we have to continually go, did you monitor this? Did you check this? How hot was it? Did you use a thermometer? We just make sure that they're doing the same method every time. And then it's also for us, it's easier to trust. It's what we call design-based control. It's not necessarily related to the individual. It's like you just make it sit like this and it's always going to work. So with that, I thank you much. And I do hope that you know that sometimes it's okay to be shallow. And I think I have a couple of 15 minutes or so if we have questions. Otherwise, you can reach out to me directly. Again, I want to thank you for giving me the space and the time. I'm so impressed with your program. I was taking screenshots of your poll, send to my team. I love that I had music to listen to during the break. I think it's just awesome that you're doing this for sanitarians. And so I thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the time. If you ever need anything, please feel free to reach out to Washington.
Thank you so much, Susan. You have a lot of positive comments
Oh, good.
in the Q&A and in the chat. So thank you so much. It does look like we have a couple of questions. So for your FBI causes slide, they're asking what C13 other was.
Yeah, let me pull that up. You're sharing screen. Okay, let me pull up my report real quick. So yeah, C13 other is, if you're familiar with NEARS, can be filled with all sorts of things. So let me pull up and see what it was back last year. I don't remember off the top of my head. I'll answer another one though if there's another. Oh, fast talking is best. Okay, I like whoever anonymous that one is. I really do try to tone down my speed, but
Yeah, no worries. There is
okay.
another question.
Okay. I see one about stainless steel versus plastic. I have, oh, I like the next question too. I don't know if that's your variance person asking me that. I have a study that has talked about the difference that you see between plastic and stainless steel. And while plastic is a insulator, it is some of that recent research that I showed also shows that there is a little bit of a slowdown with plastic. It's kind of negligible. It really is. When it really is the surface area. Everything that we have found is it's totally the surface area. So we've done a lot of different studies on some that's, moderately insulated. So most of the plastic is just, it's just a little bit thicker than metal and it's not conductive. I mean, that's why it doesn't cool as fast. But sometimes you'll have plastic that actually has a little bit of insulated layer. And as long as it does not have a top cover, and so the entire base of it is uncovered, or like that is what we need to have the cooling. All right, so shallow layer and that uncovered. And so again, the point is it's not the connection with the surface. It's not cooling necessarily through conduction, it's convection. And so it's letting that surface area evaporatively cool off the top. So that's a great question. And I will say that you will see that periodically. But the driving force is the surface area and the depth. Okay. And then someone asked about the cooling process. I can talk about that a little bit. Honestly, I have to look at the parts per million of this incoming sodium nitrite, but 100% do we allow that? Now that's under that is when they're curing product in-house, I think is what you're talking about. But we would allow them to do a slow cool. And it's because we follow the USDA small compliance guidelines. If you're not familiar with them, it's 100% recommend for me. But there are two, we call them Appendix A and Appendix B. Appendix A gives you a wide variety of cooking temperatures that you can use based on the product. So you'll see like our code only goes from 130 down, low temperature of 130 for an intact roast for 112 minutes, right? You'll see that in the food code. But that's what the USDA document does. It does it for pork, it does it for poultry, and it'll sit there and go, okay, if you're going to cook poultry at 150, this is how long you have to cook it to get a full lethality for salmonella, is what it's doing. Okay. So Appendix A is lethality, so cooking, and then Appendix B is cooling. It's stabilization, is what USDA calls it. So Appendix B then goes, if you have a product that has nitrate in it, and it's at this, like you said, nitrite, it's at this level, then you can actually slow cool those. So that's what I would recommend to you. And yes, we do allow it, but both of those, because we're modifying the food code, they are under a variance. But yes, so I can link those if you're interested, but 100% recommend on those two documents. Do y'all ask the operator to voluntarily destroy the food that you see wasn't cooled properly? Yes, we do. And that is a sticky wicket because sometimes the temperature of the food's 38 degrees. They're like, yeah, but they're like, well, we cooled it like 3 days ago. So we want to encourage them to be open with us, right? And be transparent. We don't want them to say, yeah, I just did it 30 minutes ago. And we're like, yeah, your numbers don't match. And so what we also do is we work with our inspectors on how to use evidence. There's a lot of different evidence that you can use to show if something is cooled correctly. All right, so the ways that you would do that, you would take some ambient temperatures of other pieces of food and go, all the rest of this food was, I don't know, 38 as well. But this one was in this depth of a layer. The PIC stated it was done this day. You can do a cooling study or a cooling time frame and go, there's just no way if it was hot that it would even cool down to 38, in that span of time. We look for signs of evidence such as congealed fat layers, congealed gelatin. I mean, we look for different things and go, yeah, I had to break through this solid layer of fat. That's an indicator it was in that container the whole time. There's a lot of different ways that we do that. Another one is the moisture condensation. We will look at that before we pull off the lid. And if there's a substantial amount where it actually starts to like drip and it's not just a whole bunch of little microbe dots on the top, it's like, no, this is actual water that was cooled with a lid on it. So there are a lot of things that we do, but we definitely do discard for that. And it is painful, which is, okay, I want to emphasize this. And I've got 10 minutes. I have a tendency to go long, even though I talk fast. So I appreciate you waiting with me here with Rebecca. But We do why we coach on this, even when we don't see cooling, because nobody likes to throw food away. So that's why it's like, okay, wait, I see you have a lot of hot holding. Oh, I see you have a lot of these large cuts of meat. Tell me how you do this. Because it's rare that we actually get to see cooled or cooling food. So yes, we coach on that while we're out there. How do you cool this down? Talk to me about it, when you're working with them, because that's a lot easier to have an open conversation than it is once it's cold and you're gonna have to throw it away. They're gonna try to say, I don't want to throw this food away. And I'm like, I don't blame you. Okay, long way for me to answer that. But yes, we definitely do have them voluntarily discard. If they don't, we will have them put a hold order on it, to do a little bit more research to see if we can find any way that we can prove that they cooled it down in a proper method. And then if not, then we will request discard. And so at that point, it's us requiring it. But generally they will discard. We seldom have to do order on it. But I just really want to reiterate, just do as much coaching as you can when you're out there working with them in the field before you see cooling. You want to stop this before it starts. Any consideration for restaurants that do not have a walk-in cooling? Yeah, that's a great question. So what we're talking about here is if they don't have a walk-in, but they may have a reach-in. I will tell you, we do allow reach-ins to cool. We don't necessarily require commercial in the code. We follow the same thing in the code, but I think most of our jurisdictions say you have to have a commercial unit, just to make sure that it can be accessed often and still maintain temperature. My comment would be if I think that's how you're going to see it in the FDA version when it comes out in the food code, is that they have to do like a continuous temperature monitoring. And to me, that makes sense. If they're not able to maintain that temperature at 41, then that equipment does not work, right? So that's where I would focus. So when I was at local, I would use like a reach-in, a two-door reach-in. We will only allow them to cool on the top shelf. So we limited their space. They couldn't cool on the whole thing. We're like top shelf, because you have to be uncovered. Like that's where the airflow gets and nothing can drip into it. So we would limit them in quantity based on what they had. So with walk-ins, where they're limited with walk-ins usually, it has to be operating. You'll still have some walk-ins that are barely, like at 45. I mean, they're rough. So it has to be cold enough. But often they'll push a lot of food in and they'll use the food on every single, line. So that's usually how we limit them there. Is there a difference between plastic wrap and regular plastic or stainless? Oh, that's a good question. Is my connection okay, Rebecca? I see that I'm getting a little bit of a tickle.
Yeah, sometimes it cuts in and out, but it's not cutting out enough where we're missing what you're saying. But if you wanted to turn your camera off, it might help with your connection.
Yeah, I think I will.
Okay.
Okay. Um, so there probably is a difference between plastic wrap and regular, like solid lids. However, we don't allow either one. I will say it is a study that I'm interested in doing. So both plastic wrap and like a piece of parchment, because we've seen that, but we're like, no, we require no lids. So it is a study that I'm interested in doing, but that'll be like future work. Right now, we are still at the 100% no cover. So it's a great question. There probably is a difference, but we allow no buffer in between. Does cooling uncovered come with a higher risk of cross-contamination? Not if it doesn't have anything over it. So that's where we talked about you have to put it on the top shelf. You have to keep it so there's nothing above it. And then you do have to cool it. So the cooling requirement is that you have to cover it once it hits 41. That's in the current FDA food code as well. But it shouldn't be at an increased risk of cross-contamination. The risk is greater with improper cooling than it would be with cross-contamination, unless it's stored incorrectly. I might have to get back to the person that's asking me about the C13. I will look at that. And I'm happy to explain those to people. Let me see if I can find it. If you're ever interested, we love to talk about our NEARS reports, but the C13 is generally something that was not included in the C1 through 12. So it's like it's an anomaly. It's like, okay, it didn't match any of those. This is what we called it. So I'll have to look that up. If you can either type in your name or something, I'll make sure I get that back to the sanitarians here.
And if you wanted to type it in chat, you're more than welcome to if you have time.
Okay. Well, I'll probably do it when I'm offline. And then important to ask when kitchen is open, when cooling often done versus when the restaurant opens, they plan for early morning inspections. Yeah, it's good too. So you can often observe things during an early morning inspection to kind of get a flavor. Honestly, I would encourage you if you do them at night or in the afternoon, talk to me about how you cool this. It is okay for you to train them and correct it in the first place. Because if you find it in the morning, you're like, whoa. I mean, I'm encouraging you to try. Don't get me wrong. But, if you inspect usually in the afternoon and you start seeing heating, you got a whole bunch of stuff here and it's really, really deep. Talk to me about how you cool this down. I don't see you have enough space. I usually sit there and go, dedicate space here where you're going to actually have cooling. Train your staff. Talk to me about how you're going to train your staff on this. So yes, it's good to go at any time. In the morning, you might find things that were improperly cooled. You have to be prepared for that. The rest of your team might go, whoa, you marked this out and it was 38. And it's like, yeah, I think they used an improper process. So that's a good conversation for you to have with your team. Can you speak on what putting several pans of foods very hot in the refrigerator temperature? Yeah, that's usually where we require a walk-in. You want to have a lot of capacity. And when I mean capacity, I mean just empty space that doesn't have anything in it, but it has cold air. And so, yes, putting in pieces of equipment that are, hot foods, high volume, keeping the door open because they're loading and unloading will raise the temperature of a walk-in. It'll definitely raise the temperature of an under-counter refrigerator. I would never encourage anybody to use an under-counter to cool down a hot or even an ambient food, to be honest. Those things are accessed a lot. They have a tough time maintaining 41. So generally what we talk about with cooling, you may not necessarily 100% agree with this, but they don't have to put it in right away. If it's coming straight off the stove, it's like, okay, if they're monitoring it, they're like, they put it in before it gets, like below 160, but technically below 135. It's like, yeah, it can cool off a little bit. And by the time that they're portioning that into smaller, shallow layers, it will have cooled down a little bit. So what they put in from that prep will go in. And so they shouldn't be putting it in a big pot. It's like, that's why you kind of spread it out. If you look at those charts I had, you'll see where it said mixing and gave a little space before they put it in the refrigerator. That was them making all this rice and beans in big pots and then putting it into smaller containers. Just that action alone will cool that product down considerably. So there are a lot of reasons why you want to talk to an operator about the value of portioning that out and then putting it back in. Yeah, and sometimes the freezer does work better for cooling, but not because of convection. So you're right. So freezing will work well there for if it's conduction. If it's just flat out, you're just trying to let the temperature kind of seep through. So where that's going to work well is if it's packaged, which we're not usually cooling down a packaged food. So that's why you put that in ice water. You put that because you're like, I don't need convection on this. I'm flat out trying to just drive cold air or cold water. But yeah, it will work just because it's cooler, but yes, it doesn't have the convection. And so it's not something we generally recommend. And yes, we do allow cooling in freezers in answer to your question. And it will cool it. It will still cool, and often faster than the refrigerator. But again, it's just a different method that it's using. Um, oh, do we allow cooling on a vehicle? On a mobile. We only do under a variance. Going back to your lady that spoke earlier about variances, we would allow it as a variance, and it has to be time monitored. And I should rephrase how I'm saying that. They're allowed to cool if they're using, this is going to sound really strange. In Washington code, they're allowed to cool if they use it the same day if it's approved. So we'll have places, and this is where I usually see it. They cut tomatoes and they're going to cool on a mobile. It's like, okay, now you're cooling. They might make some potatoes that they're going to cool down to make into a salad. Well, like you cool it. But if they want to hold that for more than that day service, they have to have a variance. So it's a same day service. We allow them to cool on a mobile. I know that sounds kind of strange, but that's how we do it. And then, okay, I think we covered the cross-contamination. All right. Okay. I think we covered your questions. I will follow up on the C13. Again, I thank you much. Appreciate the time, the energy. I'm eager to see how this comes out in the FDA food code. And I'm hopeful that it works for you all. And let us know if you have any questions. I got to tell you, I've been doing it for, almost 30 years. So for me, it's interesting that it's novel, but it is. And I will sign off.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much for your presentation. We have been having some major cooling issues recently, so really, really glad to hear all your information there.
Okay, well, if you need any tools or anything, let us know, okay?
Definitely, absolutely.
Yeah, good luck.
Thank you so
Great
much.
conference, y'all. Thank you.